Your phone buzzes. It's the exact person you were just thinking about after months of silence. You take a different street for no reason at all. Later, you hear there was an accident exactly where you would have been standing. You wake up at 3:47 for no reason, 3 nights in a row, and on the third night, someone you love needed you at exactly that hour. You call all of this coincidence. But you've never fully believed that word, and you've never said so out loud. Here's what nobody explains to you. Your mind was trained to file these moments away before you could ask what they meant, before you could even feel the weight of them. Trained so well that now you do it to yourself, automatically, in under a second, treating a real signal like static. What if it isn't static? 100 years ago, a psychiatrist started writing down cases exactly like yours, coincidences too precise to be random, happening to real patients in real distress. Taking that seriously back then could end a career. He did it anyway. Long before him, cultures with no contact with each other, oceans apart, built entire systems around reading moments like this. And something physics has actually measured, not theorized, measured, makes the easy explanation harder to hold on to than you'd expect. If you follow this all the way through and actually apply what it shows you, the signal you've been calling coincidence won't sound like noise by the end of it. There's a particular kind of moment most adults have lived through at least once, and it rarely gets talked about with much curiosity. You're sitting in a waiting room, half listening to nothing in particular, turning over a question you've been carrying for weeks. Should I leave this job? Should I make the call? Should I finally let this go? And a stranger 2 seats away says something out loud to someone else entirely that answers it. Not vaguely, specifically. You don't ask them to repeat it. You already heard. Or the more familiar version, you finally make the decision after months of circling it, and within days an opportunity appears that wouldn't have made any sense to you a year earlier, but makes complete sense now. Right person, right room, right timing, arriving almost the moment you stopped resisting. Or maybe it's smaller than that, and stranger for being smaller. The same 3 numbers on a clock, a receipt, a license plate, showing up so often it stops feeling random long before you can explain why. You've probably never said this out loud either. Most people file these under coincidence and move on, because coincidence is a tidy word. It closes the file. It doesn't ask anything more of you. But there's a difference between a word that explains something and a word that simply ends the conversation about it. Coincidence does the second one. It tells you nothing about why it happened then, or why it happened to you specifically in that exact shape. It just gives you permission to stop wondering. Here's something simpler that happens to almost everyone, and it might be the most honest place to start. You learn a new word, or you start looking at a particular model of car because you're thinking of buying one, and suddenly it's everywhere. In conversations, on the street, in a show you've watched a dozen times before. Nothing about the world changed. The word didn't get more common overnight, and that car didn't multiply on the road. What changed is what your attention was built to filter out. It was always there. You just hadn't been trained to register it yet. Coincidence may work the same way, just one layer deeper. Not about a word or a car, but about a question you've been holding in your chest more than your head, or a fear you've been circling for years without saying out loud. When something in you finally shifts, when you stop resisting a decision, or stop arguing with a fear, or finally name something you'd been avoiding, your attention recalibrates, and the world doesn't suddenly contain more meaning than it did the day before. You just stop filtering out the parts of it that already matched what you were carrying. If that's all this was, it would already be worth slowing down for. Most people spend years trying to manufacture change from the outside. New routines, new goals, new affirmations said into a mirror, while the actual shift was always going to start with what they were paying attention to and what they'd finally stopped resisting on the inside. You may have already tried versions of this. Gratitude lists, vision boards, a morning routine you kept for 3 weeks and then quietly dropped because nothing seemed to move. That's not proof this doesn't work. It might be proof you were looking for the message in the wrong place, outside the work of actually paying attention instead of inside it. But there's a second layer to this that the frequency illusion explanation doesn't fully cover, and it's worth being honest about that too. Because some of these moments don't just reveal something you were already primed to notice. They land with a kind of precision that feels less like your own filtering and more like a response, the phrase that answers the exact question you hadn't said aloud. The door that opens the week you finally stop pushing on it. People who have studied these moments closely, not casually, not in passing, but as a serious subject of inquiry, have asked the same thing you might be asking right now. Is this only ever about what's inside us, or is something on the outside occasionally meeting us halfway? That question doesn't have a tidy answer yet, but it's a far more honest question than coincidence, and it's the one this conversation is actually built to follow. What if the moments you've been calling chance aren't deliveries from somewhere else at all, but something closer to an exchange? Your attention reaching out, and something in the structure of your life occasionally reaching back. If what happened in the last few minutes is true, if attention really can recalibrate and start letting in what it used to filter out, there's an obvious question that follows. Why isn't this common knowledge? Why did almost nobody sit you down and explain it, in school, at work, anywhere official, ever? Part of the answer has nothing to do with anyone hiding anything from you. It has to do with what certain tools were built to measure in the first place. Picture a metal detector sweeping a beach. It is genuinely excellent at its job. It will find a coin buried 6 inches down without hesitation, but it will walk directly over a love letter, a photograph, a child's drawing folded into someone's pocket for 40 years, and never beep once. Not because those things aren't real, and not because they don't matter, because the device was never built to register that kind of evidence. It has one frequency it listens for, and everything outside that frequency passes through it like it isn't there. Controlled, repeatable, externally measurable science is an extraordinary metal detector. It has cured diseases and put satellites in orbit using exactly this kind of evidence. But a feeling that arrives with timing too precise to be comfortable, a thought that resolves itself the moment a stranger says the right sentence at the right distance from you, that kind of evidence was never going to register on an instrument built to look for something else. The absence of a beep isn't proof of absence. It's proof you're holding the wrong tool for what you're looking for. You likely grew up inside a version of this same hierarchy without ever naming it. School rewarded what could be tested and graded. The news rewarded what could be filmed and repeated. Somewhere in there, most of us absorbed an unspoken ranking. What's external, provable, and repeatable counts as real. What's internal, personal and impossible to repeat on command gets quietly filed under just a feeling, worth having, maybe, but not worth saying out loud in a room full of people who might ask you to prove it. Nobody handed you that ranking in a memo. You picked it up the way you pick up an accent, by being immersed in it for years, without anyone deciding to teach it to you on purpose. And once you've absorbed it, the moments that don't fit the ranking start to feel embarrassing rather than meaningful. You notice the pattern, and then you talk yourself out of mentioning it before the sentence even finishes forming. This is where it helps to know you are not the first person to notice the gap between what gets measured and what gets lived. In the early 20th century, a Swiss psychiatrist working closely with patients, people in real distress, not abstract theory, kept running into the same problem from the other direction. Person after person would describe a coincidence so precisely timed to their inner state that calling it random felt to him like a failure of observation rather than an act of rigor. He wasn't a mystic looking for proof of magic. He was a clinician taking careful notes on what his patients actually experienced, refusing to throw data away simply because it didn't fit the instrument he'd been trained to use. He gave the pattern a name instead of a dismissal, a meaningful coincidence occurring without a direct cause and effect link between the two events, but carrying weight for the person living through it regardless. Not proof of fate, not evidence of magic. A documented recurring feature of human experience that deserved a word of its own instead of being swept into the catch-all of chance and forgotten. That single decision to name something instead of discarding it is part of why this conversation is even possible today. It moved the subject from something people quietly noticed and quietly doubted into something that could be studied, written about, and taken seriously by people who had spent their careers being skeptical for a living. What if the reason this never got taught to you wasn't that someone wanted to keep you in the dark, but that the instruments most of us were handed were simply never built to pick it up? And what might you start noticing if you stopped waiting for the metal detector to beep? Stand under a clear night sky anywhere on Earth, and you're looking at the same handful of stars our ancestors saw, scattered across continents with no roads, no ships, no shared language between them. And yet, independently, civilizations on opposite sides of the planet did the same strange thing. They drew lines between the dots and called them shapes. Different shapes, different names, completely different stories attached to them. A hunter here, a bull there, a river of light somewhere else. The constellations themselves were never the point. What mattered was the shared assumption underneath all of them. The sky was not background noise. It was something worth reading. That same instinct shows up again and again in places history books rarely connect to one another. In ancient China, a method developed for asking questions of the moment itself, not questions answered by logic, but by the specific configuration of chance at the exact instant the question was asked. Coins were thrown, or stocks were counted, and the resulting pattern was treated as meaningful precisely because of when it happened, not despite it. The underlying premise was almost identical to what that Swiss psychiatrist would describe in clinical language roughly 3,000 years later. The moment you're standing in is not a blank container. It carries information about your state, and that information can show up in what happens to arrive at that exact second. It's worth noting that he later studied this very system himself and found in it an old, formal version of the same thing he was trying to describe to a medical establishment that didn't yet have a word for it. Travel to ancient Egypt and you find something just as deliberate. Dreams weren't treated as static noise to be ignored at breakfast. Scribes and priests kept detailed records. What a particular dream image tended to precede, what kind of guidance a recurring symbol seemed to offer the person carrying it. This wasn't superstition practiced carelessly. It was methodical enough to be written down, cross-referenced, and passed on, generation after generation, as a working system for paying attention to something most modern adults have been trained to forget by the time they're out of bed. Across entirely different continents, Siberia, the Amazon, parts of North America, traditions built around close relationship with the land developed their own version of the same instinct. An animal crossing a path at an unusual time, a sudden change in weather just before a decision needed to be made. These were never treated as random scenery. They were read the way you might read a friend's tone of voice, not because every rustle in the trees carried a secret message, but because the people living closest to the land had learned over generations which patterns tended to matter and which didn't. And in a different philosophical tradition entirely, one of the oldest schools of thought to come out of India quietly questioned something most of us never think to question. The assumption that you and the world in front of you are two separate, fully independent things. Not by denying that the world exists outside your head, but by suggesting that the observer and the observed arise together in the same moment, shaped in part by each other. If that's even partly true, it would help explain something strange. Why a shift in someone's inner state so often seems to coincide with a shift in what shows up around them. Not because thinking something hard enough forces it into existence, because the line between in here and out there may never have been as solid as it's convenient to assume. None of this, on its own, proves anything. People in different eras, with no access to each other's findings, can still arrive at the same wrong idea independently. That happens in history too. But it's worth sitting with the sheer number of unrelated cultures, separated by oceans and centuries and language and religion, that all built something, a method, a record, a discipline, around the same basic intuition. That pattern in the world is not decoration. It's communication, even if no one has ever fully agreed on who or what is doing the communicating. What's strange is that this old intuition has recently found unexpected company in a place that has nothing to do with ritual, prophecy, or ancient scripture at all. A physics lab, where some very careful, very skeptical people started noticing something equally hard to dismiss. For a long time, the conversation about meaningful coincidence stayed exactly where you'd expect. Psychology, philosophy, religion, the parts of human life that are hardest to put under a microscope. Then physics, of all places, started asking questions that sounded strangely similar. Not about meaning, but about something almost as unsettling. Whether the universe behaves differently, depending on whether something is watching it. Picture a hurricane forecast a week before landfall. The map doesn't show one line. It shows a cone, a wide spread of possible paths, all of them genuinely possible given what's known at that moment. Nobody can tell you exactly where the storm will go, because in a very real sense, it hasn't gone anywhere yet. It exists as a range of outcomes. Only when the storm actually moves does that wide cone collapse down into one single, specific, undeniable path. At the scale of individual particles, something with the same basic shape turns out to be true, and it's not poetic license. It's measured, replicated, mainstream physics. Before being observed in certain experiments, a particle behaves as though it occupies a whole range of possible states at once, the way the storm occupies a whole range of possible paths. The instant a measurement is taken, that range collapses down into one specific, locatable outcome. This isn't a metaphor scientists use to be charming. It's one of the most carefully tested results in modern physics. What that means for a hurricane, a job offer, or a phone call from someone you were just thinking about is a question physics has not fully closed the door on. The famous thought experiment involving a sealed box and a cat in two states at once was actually invented by a physicist trying to show how strange it would sound if you stretch this particle-scale behavior directly onto a full-sized, everyday object. What stays true, carefully, is this. At the smallest scales we can measure, looking changes what there is to find. It's a door physics opened. What's on the other side of it is still being figured out by people far more careful than most of what gets repeated about it online. A separate, equally well-documented finding adds another layer. Two particles that interact and then separate, even across enormous distances, can remain correlated in a way that has no obvious explanation through ordinary cause and effect. Measuring one instantly tells you something about the other, no matter how far apart they've traveled. This is real. It's been tested repeatedly, and it earned a Nobel Prize. What it suggests is that the universe may be more stitched together at its foundation than the version we experience day to day. Separate objects, separate events, separate lives would lead anyone to guess. It was a question close to that one, not about particles, but about people, that a Mexican neuroscientist decided to test directly decades ago with actual instruments instead of speculation. He trained two people to sit together in silence until they reported a felt sense of connection, then separated them into different rooms, shielded from any sensory contact with each other, and recorded their brain activity throughout. In a number of these sessions, something showed up on the recordings of the separated partner at almost the same moment something happened to the first, a result he never claimed proved telepathy, but one he also refused to throw away simply because it didn't fit a tidy explanation. This work was never replicated widely enough for mainstream neuroscience to treat it as settled fact. It remains a contested, unresolved corner of research. What happened to him afterward is its own unresolved question, and it deserves to be told honestly rather than dramatically. In 1994, he disappeared. No body was ever found. No explanation was ever confirmed. Some who've studied the case think it had nothing to do with his work at all. Others think the timing, right as his research into shared consciousness was drawing wider attention, is too pointed to dismiss outright. Nobody actually knows. That's not a satisfying ending, but it's the true one. What stays after the uncertainty clears is this. Serious, trained scientists, working with real instruments rather than wishful thinking, have repeatedly bumped into the same suspicion that ancient traditions arrived at without any instruments at all, that the line between one mind and the world around it might be thinner and more permeable than it appears from inside an ordinary Tuesday. If particles separated by miles can still answer for each other, what does it actually mean that the people closest to you so often seem to feel what you're feeling before you've said a word? If you've ever seen a real hologram, not a flat picture, but the kind made with laser light recorded on special film, There's a detail about them that sounds almost like a trick until you actually witness it. Cut the film in half, and you don't get half a picture. You get the whole image again, just slightly less sharp. Cut that piece in half again, and the whole image is still there, a little blurrier still. Keep cutting, and the whole keeps showing up inside every smaller piece, all the way down, for as long as the fragment is large enough to register anything at all. A novelist and science writer named Michael Talbot spent years following this property of holograms into a much bigger question, drawing on serious work from two researchers who actually did the science: a physicist who studied the deep structure of matter, and a neuroscientist who studied how the brain processes information. Their shared, still debated proposal was that the universe at its most fundamental level might be organized something like that piece of holographic film, a structure in which the whole is somehow folded into every part, and what we experience as separate, disconnected objects and events is closer to a kind of localized readout of something more unified underneath. But it's a serious enough idea, built on real, peer-reviewed groundwork, that it earns more than a dismissive glance. If something like that turned out to be even partly true, it would mean the separation you feel between yourself and a circumstance you keep encountering, a recurring kind of relationship, a recurring kind of financial stress, a recurring kind of door that won't open, might be less absolute than it feels from inside it, not because wishing hard enough rearranges the fabric of reality, because the fabric might never have been as divided as it looks at 3 in the afternoon on an ordinary Tuesday. Here's where this stops being abstract and becomes something you can actually test in your own life, starting today. Strike a tuning fork and hold a second one of the exact same pitch nearby without touching it. The second fork starts to hum, faintly but unmistakably, in response to a vibration it never received through direct contact. This isn't folklore, it's basic, well-documented acoustic physics, sympathetic resonance, the same principle that lets one piano string set another vibrating across a room. The forks don't communicate, they simply share a frequency, and one disturbs the air in a way the other is built to receive. Your emotional state may not be so different from that struck tuning fork. Fear, documented and replicated in actual research on attention and perception, narrows what you notice. It pulls your focus toward threat, toward what could go wrong, toward the exits. Calm and curiosity do something measurably different. They widen the range of what you're able to take in. More options, more people, more small openings you'd have walked straight past while scanning for danger. 2 people can stand in the exact same room, at the exact same job interview, the exact same family dinner, and walk away having registered almost entirely different rooms, because their nervous systems were tuned to receive different frequencies of what was actually there. This is probably not new information to you in spirit, even if it's never been explained quite this way. You may have already tried gratitude journals, vision boards, words you repeated to yourself that your body never quite believed, and if nothing visibly changed afterward, it likely wasn't because the underlying idea was nonsense. It's that repeating a sentence you don't yet feel safe believing doesn't change your nervous system's resonant frequency. It just adds another sentence to a body that's still, underneath the words, bracing for the usual outcome. The tuning fork doesn't hum because someone described the right pitch to it out loud. It hums because something nearby is actually vibrating at that pitch. What you've likely been calling manifestation may have far less to do with asking the universe for something it was withholding, and far more to do with which frequency you're walking around resonating at, and what that frequency is quietly screening in or screening out before you ever consciously notice it's happening. If two pieces of metal with no nerves and no thoughts at all can still answer each other across open air just by sharing a pitch, what might be answering you right now simply because of the frequency you've been carrying without realizing it? If your nervous system really is a tuning fork, quietly broadcasting and receiving on a frequency you didn't consciously choose, there's a shift in how that changes your relationship to your own life. You stop being someone things merely happen to and start being someone whose state is actively shaping what gets noticed, what gets approached, and what gets allowed to stay. That's a heavier sentence than it sounds like at first, so it's worth slowing down here. This isn't a verdict that every hardship in your life was somehow invited in by your own bad attitude. That's not what this is saying, and it would be cruel if it were. The pattern you keep meeting, the relationship that rhymes with the last one, the financial ceiling that won't lift no matter how hard you push, isn't proof you're broken or doing this wrong. It's closer to a smoke detector that's still wired from an old kitchen fire years ago, one that no longer exists, going off anytime something even slightly resembles heat. The detector isn't malfunctioning. It's loyal to a danger that used to be real. Calling it a flaw misses what it's actually doing for you, and has been doing for you, for a very long time. What does shift once you see it this way is where you put your attention next, not toward blame, toward authorship, not, why does this keep happening to me, but, what is this pattern still protecting me from, and is that protection still necessary? That single change in the question you're asking is most of the distance between feeling like a victim of your own life and feeling like someone quietly, gradually starting to write it. If you've made it this far with me, you're clearly someone who wants more than a comforting sentence. You want to actually understand the mechanism. That's exactly the kind of person this channel is built for, and if that's you, I'd genuinely love to have you stick around. Subscribing means you won't miss the next piece of this, and we put out something new like this most days. While you're here, I'd love to know in the comments, what's the most precisely timed coincidence you've ever lived through, the one you've never quite been able to explain away? I read everyone, and some of the best moments in this work have come directly from what people share down there. Now, back to where we were, because there's one more layer to how this co-creation actually shows up day to day, and it's probably already been happening to you more than you've given it credit for. Think about an inside joke with someone you've known for years. One word, a name, a random object, a moment from a trip you took together, and you're both laughing before either of you finishes the sentence. To anyone else in the room, that word means nothing. It's just a vegetable, or a street name, or a strange thing someone's cousin said once. The meaning isn't in the word. It's in the shared history between the two of you that made that word carry weight. Symbols, numbers, and recurring patterns seem to work the same private way. You'll hear plenty of people online insist that seeing the same repeating numbers always means one specific thing, as if there's a universal dictionary everyone's supposed to memorize. There isn't. What actually seems to matter is much closer to that inside joke. Certain numbers, certain animals, certain recurring dream images start showing up to you, specifically, often clustered around moments when you're already wrestling with a decision or a fear. The pattern isn't proof of a hidden universal code. It's closer to your own attention, leaving itself a bookmark, a way of flagging, "You've been here before, pay attention," using whatever symbol happened to be sitting nearby when the moment mattered. The skill worth building isn't memorizing what a stranger online says a particular number is supposed to mean. It's noticing what actually rises in you: calm, dread, recognition, a held breath, the moment something repeats. That reaction is the real information. The symbol is just the envelope it arrived in. And once you start paying attention to your own private language instead of someone else's universal one, you'll probably notice it isn't only showing up in dreams, animals, and numbers anymore. It's showing up somewhere far more ordinary, in your phone, scrolling through a feed that seems to know exactly what to put in front of you. You've felt this one too, almost certainly. You have a conversation with someone, completely out loud, about a product you've never searched for before, and within hours, an ad for that exact thing shows up in your feed. It feels uncanny enough that people half joke their phones are listening, and depending on app permissions, sometimes they actually are. But most of the time, something far less dramatic and far more impressive is happening. The platform has been quietly tracking your typing patterns, your location, your social circle, the pause length before you skip a video, for months or years, building a model of you detailed enough that it can often guess what you're about to want before you've fully wanted it yourself. It's less like magic and more like a friend who's known you so long they finish your sentences, except this friend was built from data instead of decades of shared history. That explanation accounts for a lot of it. It doesn't quite account for all of it. The song that starts playing, unrequested, the exact second you needed to hear those specific words. The comment from a stranger on a video you found by accident that answers a question you'd only ever said out loud to yourself. Algorithms are good. They are not yet good enough to explain every version of this, and it's worth being honest about that gap, rather than forcing a tidy explanation onto every single instance. What's actually more interesting than either extreme, "it's all just data," or "it's all cosmic communication," is what this tells you about the bigger pattern you've been building toward this whole time. Whether the message arrives through a recurring number, a stranger's sentence, or a targeted ad, it's still arriving through whatever channel happens to be closest to you in that moment. The phone in your pocket isn't separate from the rest of this. It's just the newest, fastest mirror available, reflecting back whatever you've already been carrying: your fears, your half-formed decisions, your unspoken questions, at a speed nothing in human history has ever managed before. And a mirror this responsive can become a problem the moment you stop treating it like a mirror and start treating it like a verdict. An ad that confirms your fear isn't proof the fear is accurate. A post that seems to validate a decision you already secretly wanted to make isn't permission from a higher power. The healthy version of noticing these moments sharpens your thinking and your follow-through. The unhealthy version turns every notification into an oracle and quietly trades your own judgment for whatever happened to scroll past at the right second. The difference isn't in the sign, it's in whether you're still the one doing the deciding. Underneath all of this, the phone, the numbers, the stranger's sentence, there's an organ doing more of the filtering than most people ever give it credit for. and it isn't the one between your ears. Your heart generates the largest measurable electromagnetic field produced by any organ in your body, detectable several feet outside your skin with the right instruments. This isn't metaphor. It's been measured directly in cardiac research for decades. More striking still, the bulk of the signaling between heart and brain runs upward, from heart to brain, not the other direction most people assume. Your heart rhythm shifts measurably with your emotional state, and that shift changes, in turn, how clearly and how creatively your brain is able to process whatever's actually in front of you. A racing, erratic heart rhythm under stress correlates with narrower, more reactive thinking. A steady, coherent rhythm correlates with broader, clearer thinking. The same broadened attention from a few minutes ago, now traced down to an actual organ instead of an abstract idea. Think of it less like a poetic symbol and more like a lighthouse. A lighthouse doesn't decide which ships to help. It simply holds a steady signal, broadcast continuously, whether or not anyone happens to be looking for it that night. Ships further out adjust their course around that signal long before they can consciously explain why. Your own steadiness or your own static may be doing something quietly similar to everyone and everything in range of you, including, it turns out, what you end up noticing as out there in the first place. If your heart has been broadcasting all along, whether or not you are paying attention to it, the next real question isn't whether the signal exists. It's whether you've ever actually learned how to read your own. If a synchronicity is genuinely information and not just noise, the only honest way to know which one you're dealing with is the same way you'd know anything else worth trusting. Not from a single instance, but from a pattern that holds up over time. This is where a lot of people quietly give up too early. They notice one striking coincidence, feel something shift in their chest, and then forget about it within a week because nothing was written down, and memory, on its own, is a terrible record keeper. It edits. It forgets the boring details and exaggerates the dramatic ones until the story barely resembles what actually happened. A naturalist tracking bird migration doesn't trust a single sighting either. One unusual bird in your backyard could mean almost anything. A storm blew it off course. It got lost. It's simply passing through. But a naturalist who writes down every sighting, every date, every direction for months, eventually sees something memory alone would have missed entirely. A real pattern, repeatable and specific, hiding inside what looked like scattered randomness up close. The practice isn't complicated, it's just consistent. A simple page kept somewhere you'll actually return to, noting what happened, what you were already feeling or wrestling with right before it happened, and what you did afterward. Over weeks, not days, the entries start talking to each other in a way no single one of them could on its own. This doesn't need to turn into another task you abandon after 3 tries, the way the gratitude journal did. A page a week is enough. What matters isn't the discipline of it. It's that you're finally giving your own life the same respect you'd give a study you actually cared about getting right. There's a quieter practice worth mentioning alongside it, and it asks for almost nothing. Before you reach for your phone in the morning, or right before you fall asleep at night, give yourself 60 seconds of nothing. No input, no scrolling, just your own breath moving in and out, your attention resting on whatever's actually present in your body. Nearly the whole day gets spent reacting to the outside world, leaving almost no room for the inside one to surface on its own terms. That 60 seconds isn't a ritual you need to believe in. It's simply the only part of the day when the signal isn't being drowned out by everything else demanding your attention. The deepest, most consistent mirror most people live inside, though, isn't a journal entry or a quiet moment. It's the people who keep showing up in their life, wearing slightly different faces, but somehow delivering the same emotional weather every time. Stand at the edge of a canyon and shout, and what comes back isn't someone else's voice answering you. It's your own voice, returned from a different direction, sometimes so delayed and distorted you don't immediately recognize it as your own. Relationships have a way of doing exactly this. The partner who eventually withholds the same way an earlier one did. The friend group that somehow always ends up making you feel exactly as invisible as you felt at 15. The boss who triggers the same tightening in your chest your father used to. It rarely feels like an echo in the moment. It feels like the world being unfair to you. Specifically, again. It's worth being precise here, because this is a place where this kind of conversation can quietly slide into something cruel if you're not careful. What happened to you? The people who hurt you? The things that were done without your consent was not something you called in, asked for, or deserved, and nothing here should ever be twisted into suggesting otherwise. But the pattern in how you've responded since then, who you find yourself drawn to afterward, what level of disrespect starts to feel oddly familiar instead of alarming, what you've quietly learned to call normal. That part often is an echo, bouncing your own unresolved history back at you through someone else's behavior. The canyon isn't responsible for the sound. It only returns whatever was shouted into it in the first place. That distinction matters because it changes what you're actually allowed to do about it. You can't rewrite what already happened to you, but you can learn to recognize your own echo clearly enough to finally stop mistaking it for someone else's voice and start noticing, with something closer to curiosity than dread, what it might sound like if you shouted something different into that same canyon from here on out. Go back, for a moment, to the two small scenes this conversation opened with. Someone you hadn't spoken to in months, crossing your mind right before your phone buzzed with their name. A street you took for no clear reason, only to learn later that something happened exactly where you would have been. You already know now most of what was actually happening underneath both of them. Not a universe pausing its business to send you a personal memo. Something quieter, and in its own way, stranger. Your attention, tuned by whatever you were carrying that day, catching a frequency it would have filtered out on an ordinary Tuesday. A nervous system, like a tuning fork, humming in response to something nearby that happened to match its pitch. A heart, broadcasting steadily whether or not you were ever taught to notice the signal. An old instinct shared by people who carved meaning into bone and stone long before anyone had a word like psychology, that the moment you're standing in is never quite as empty as it looks. None of that makes the phone call or the different street any less remarkable. If anything, it makes them more remarkable because the explanation isn't smaller than the mystery. It's just more honest about where the mystery actually lives, not somewhere out past the stars, waiting to intervene on your behalf. In you. In the frequency you've been carrying without realizing anyone or anything was listening. You don't need to go chasing these moments from here on out. They were never something to hunt down. They were always something to notice, which means the only real work left is learning to recognize your own signal clearly enough to stop being surprised when something answers it. Keep paying attention like this, and you'll notice something start to shift, not the world changing around you. How much less of it can hide from you? If this is the kind of conversation that actually changes how you walk through your week, not just how you feel for the next 10 minutes, I'd ask you for 3 small things, and I mean all 3 sincerely. Follow this channel because we're building this one piece at a time, almost every day, and I don't want you missing the next layer of it. Send this to 5 people who'd actually sit with it instead of scrolling past it, the kind of people who've also felt something land too precisely to call it nothing. And leave a comment, a real one, about a coincidence you've carried for years without ever saying out loud. Tell me, too, what you want this channel to go looking for next. Some of the deepest places this work has gone started with exactly that. Someone in the comments asking the question I hadn't gotten to yet. There's a particular kind of stillness that shows up after a conversation like this one. Not relief exactly, and not excitement either. Something quieter than both. The stillness of someone who just realized they've been standing at the edge of a canyon their whole life, shouting, without ever once stopping to listen for what kept coming back. The phone is going to buzz again sometime soon. A street is going to feel, for no clear reason, like the wrong one to take. When it happens, you won't need anyone to tell you what it means. You'll already be listening.